We're aware now that there were a total of 7 people injured yesterday. There are 5 people in hospital. 3 are in a critical condition. The remaining victims have been treated and are recovering at home. I know we are all continuing to think of them and the traumatic experience that they have been through. No terrorist, whether alive or deceased, deserves their name to be shared for the infamy they were seeking.
As I noted yesterday, there was nothing unusual about the subject's routine as he travelled by train to the supermarket in Lynn Mall. In fact, some of his actions yesterday suggested that he was planning for the future. He arrived at the supermarket about 2:27 p.m, and the surveillance team following him observed him take a shopping trolley and start shopping. He was shopping normally for about 10 minutes before the attack started. As I noted yesterday, it was about 60 seconds from the time our people became aware of a commotion to when they engaged the offender and shot him. However, CCTV footage has shown that the first stabbing occurred some 60 to 90 seconds before our teams heard shouts and saw people running. Long-term surveillance of a surveillance-conscious subject is very difficult. Surveillance teams must work hard not to be recognised, otherwise the surveillance becomes ineffective. We need to be clear, surveillance is different from a security detail. We have had no legal grounds to detain this subject. Monitoring his actions has been entirely dependent on the surveillance teams being able to maintain their cover as they have watched him over an extended period. These are highly trained specialists who follow international best practice for their tradecraft. They are very good at what they do. Over a period of time, the subject has demonstrated a high level of paranoia about surveillance activity. You'll also appreciate that supermarkets are not operating normally at present under level 4 lockdown conditions. Other people in proximity to the subject are much more conspicuous, and the risk of compromise is greatly increased. As a result, our surveillance staff were not able to move around the supermarket with the subject, although they remained close at the entrance, having observed him start shopping as he had done other times. To be clear, I remain of the view that our police staff acted exactly the way we would have expected them to in this situation, and with great bravery and professionalism. I particularly want to acknowledge the first aid provided by the attending staff and other responders who are well trained, and the members of the public who helped. I have no doubt the first aid rendered has made a very significant difference for the victims in this case. In addition to the attending STG members who are trained in advanced first aid, our other staff attending included a trained paramedic who played a key role in triaging the victims and initiating treatment. We were also helped by members of the public, at least one of whom had an advanced level of training. I want to particularly acknowledge the victims and their families. They will be going through great anguish as a result of this horrific situation, and we will do everything we can to support them. I also recognise that the staff at the supermarket, and indeed at all similar places, will be shocked that such an incident could play out in their workplace. We will provide the best visible presence we can around such locations over the coming period.
The individual who committed yesterday's attack arrived in New Zealand in October 2011. He was 22 years old and travelling on a student visa. It was not known that he held extreme views about violence and terrorism at that time. In 2016, he came to the attention of the police after he expressed sympathy on Facebook for recent terrorist attacks, violent war-related videos, and comments advocating violent extremism. He was spoken to by the police twice, once in April of 2016 and then again in May. This activity online continued, and in May of 2017, he was arrested at Auckland International Airport. Police believed at that time he was heading to Syria. A search of his apartment led them to discover restricted publications and a hunting knife. He was charged with possessing these things. He eventually pleaded guilty to charges of knowingly distributing restricted publications, fraud, and failing to assist police in the execution of their search powers. He was released on bail. In August 2018, whilst on bail, the individual bought a knife. The police arrested him again. but also issued a search warrant and found objectionable or extremist material. He was charged with additional charges of possessing objectionable material, possession of an offensive weapon, and failing to assist the police in exercising their search powers. On this occasion, he was kept in custody. In September 2018, the individual was sentenced to 12 months supervision in relation to the first set of charges. He remained in prison due to the additional charges that he'd already committed while on bail. In September of 2018, ministers were briefed and then directed officials to undertake further policy work on counter-terrorism legislation. Work progressed throughout 2019, and this included policy work to criminalise preparatory acts which might be related to a terrorist intent or plan. Meanwhile, in July of 2020, the Crown made an unsuccessful attempt to lay an additional charge under the existing Terrorism Suppression Act for the knife and online posts, but this was rejected by the High Court. The original criminal charges of unlawfully possessing these items were still valid though, and so throughout this period he was remanded in custody awaiting sentencing. You may also be aware that during this time he assaulted corrections officers and faced charges on these acts also. In the meantime, work on changing the law to add an offence of committing a preparatory act progressed, and a draft bill was introduced in Parliament in April 2021. It had its first reading in May. Now, throughout this period, officials met a number of times to consider what avenues could be pursued to address the risks posed by this individual and to prepare for the potential that we may run out of legal avenues to detain him. I was briefed on this particular work in May 2021. I sought further advice on whether prevention orders could be used and whether the individual had been psychologically assessed. I was later advised that prevention orders could not be used and that he had refused psychological assessment. At this time, work around his immigration status was also underway, but this is detail I am hopeful I can share more with you on tomorrow. In May 2021, he was convicted in the High Court on the charges of possession of objectionable publications with knowledge and failing to assist the police in exercising search powers. He was found not guilty of another charge of possessing objectionable material and the charge of possessing a knife in a public place. On the 6th of July, he was sentenced to 12 months supervision with special conditions. These conditions included that he must reside at the named address, could only possess an electronic device capable of accessing the internet other than that provided by his probation officer. He was also required upon request to make available any electronic device to the probation officer for the purpose of checking or cloning the device, and to disclose to his probation officer and provide access to all social media accounts. He was also required to attend rehabilitation, assessment and treatment. GPS monitoring was sought by the Crown, but this was not imposed by the courts. At the time of sentencing, the individual had spent approximately 3 years in prison on remand. He remained in custody, but given all legal avenues to continue his detention had been exhausted, officials prepared for his release. Risk mitigations were already underway. This included police standing up surveillance coverage, including the use of the Armed Special Tactics Group. This is the group who were present yesterday at the scene and shot the terrorist. Police also worked alongside the NZSIS. Corrections also advised that he would be reporting to the Newlands Service Centre, where there would be a police presence. Prior to his release, police identified that he could be arrested without a warrant for breach of his conditions, and that there were other trigger points which would allow him to be arrested, including committing or threatening to commit a violent act, acquiring weapons, or consuming objectionable material. In mid-July, the individual was released into the community and the surveillance began immediately. In late July, I was given a written update on the case. On the 9th of August, I met with officials and discussed further options to try and reduce the risk that this person posed to the community. In late August, officials, including the Commissioner of Police, raised the possibility of expediting the amendments to the counter-terrorism legislation. Within 48 hours of these discussions, the Minister of Justice contacted the Chair of the Select Committee with the intention of speeding that law change up. That was yesterday, the same day the attack happened. As you can see, agencies used every tool available to them to protect innocent people from this individual. Every legal avenue was tried.
Firstly, I want to be clear that cases of this type are highly unusual. Whilst there are many people with concerning ideologies, very few of them reach the highest level of concern. And of those, it is this case that has caused us the greatest concern. We continue to pay a close eye on the environment, monitoring it for emerging risks. The terrorism threat level remains at medium. I want to acknowledge that events like this can bring out disturbing attitudes from a small proportion of people in our community. We'll be keeping an eye out for unlawful activity motivated by hate. We'll be conducting high visibility reassurance patrols around shopping centres and other places where people gather. I'd like to note that there's already much misinformation circulating about yesterday's events. I'd ask the public to exercise careful judgment about what they believe and the sources of information they select. It's an unfortunate reality that events like this lead to much inaccurate information and speculation being fed into the public domain, particularly online. Finally, I wish to make clear that this incident should not give rise to undue concern amongst the public. This case is an outlier, and we are not looking for anyone else in relation to yesterday's events.
We already have changes to the terrorism suppression laws underway, with the departmental report just being reported back to Select Committee. That means the public have had their say, and now Parliament must act. I'm committing that as soon as Parliament resumes, we will complete that work. That means working to pass the law as soon as possible, and no later than by the end of this month. I want to thank the Leader of the Opposition for reaching out to offer her support for this course of action. There is one additional piece of work that I instigated in August, which is also relevant to this case. Unfortunately, it requires the suppression order to be lifted, so I'll provide an update on that when that occurs. To finish today, I have two final things I want to say. The first is to the New Zealand Police. You were tireless, and I am told at times you had up to 30 people involved in monitoring this person. I want to acknowledge the work that you did leading up to this event and the work you do generally to keep us all safe. I also want to acknowledge those who responded at the scene and say thank you. And to the Auckland community, times are tough, and I know that you'll be feeling it right now, but we are all with you. The last thought I will leave is from the Imam of Al Noor Mosque, who knows the impact of terrorism better than anyone. He said, and I quote, "All terrorists are the same, regardless of their ideology. They stand for hate. We stand for peace and love." We have it within our powers to ensure that the actions of an individual do not create a knock-on of hate, judgment and vitriol. I know New Zealand, you'll be kind. Please wrap your arms around all of our victims, those of yesterday and those of the past.